shows it to you. Here is a function being declared, here is a function being implemented, here is a function being called. Then you kind of get out in the wild and you try to do this yourself, and I find often people are really frustrated by the error messages that they get. And the reason for the frustration is that in C++, calling and using a function requires passing two different checks. Sometimes people are getting a message from one check and trying to fix something that only the other check cares about. It's not going to make the error message go away. Specifically, you have to make the compiler happy as well as the linker happy. The compiler only cares that you declared the function. That's usually in a header file. If you've told the compiler there is a function called, in the case of our free function demo, isPrime, and it takes an integer, then that will get you no compiler error messages as long as you're calling isPrime and passing in an integer. But if you don't implement the function, the linker says, I can't find the implementation code for this to link in. Sometimes people are getting linker error messages and they go and try to change things in a header file. That's only about the compiler, and it's not going to solve your error message. The easiest way to kind of internalize which error messages are caused by which mistakes is to deliberately make a series of mistakes and check and see what error messages you get from them. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the classes and objects example from the previous demo and deliberately mess up in it a little bit. So let's start with getting the name of the function wrong when you're calling it. So it's declared properly, implemented properly. I'll use getName as an example, and I'll just accidentally type the wrong thing. And then if I build the project, I get this error, getNameX is not a member of person. If I double click the error, it repeats the message down here, and I can look and see the problem is indeed I've typed the name of the function wrong. Okay, that's easy enough to fix. And I got red wigglies for it, right? Class person has no member, getNameX. So I'll fix that. Our next possible mistake is that I get the name correct, but I either use the wrong number of parameters or the wrong type. Let's go back here, and what if I try to pass a number down to getName? We don't have a version of getName that takes a number. You see I get red wigglies. Too many arguments in function call. If I compile anyway, function does not take one arguments. Pluralization bugs are fun, aren't they? Now this applies to also not passing enough arguments or passing the wrong type. So if I come down here to set number and I pass in a string instead of a number, it says that the argument is incompatible. If I build it anyway so you can see that error message. Okay, cannot convert parameter 1 from, this is actually sort of C++ talk for that quote string, to int. And usually that's all the hint you need that, oh yeah, this is supposed to take an integer, not a string, and you can fix your problem. Sometimes you call it properly, you implement it properly, but you mess up when you declare it. So I'll just put a name change, put an X in the name, and we'll build this. So it's correct in the calling code, it's correct in the implementing code here in person.cpp, but the mistake is in the header file. Now you notice what happens, I'm getting a very large number of error messages. For one typo, I'm getting a lot of different error messages. And here's why. These first clump are when I'm compiling that main, classes and objects.cpp. Classes and objects.cpp tries to call getName twice, and the error messages are saying there is no getName. Now, there's an implementation of getName in the .cpp file, but classes and objects, when it's being compiled, the compiler just looks at what's in the header file, person.h, and there's no getName in the person.h. And so we get a pair of error messages for the correct lines here. This should be right, but because of the error in the header file, we're given sort of a false positive error here in our main. What's more, when we're compiling person.cpp and we're trying to implement getName, it gives us a series of different complaints. First it says getName, I don't know what you're talking about. And it says that here when we try to call it in the constructor and the destructor, but it also says it here when we try to implement it. Plus, it says here, what do you mean first name? What do you mean last name? Because as far as the compiler is concerned, This function, getName, isn't part of person. And if it isn't part of person, it doesn't have access to person's member variables. So we have this just boatload of error messages, all because the compiler doesn't believe that getName is part of person. And so making typos in header files can have dramatic consequences. Every single file that includes the header file is now going to have some sort of compiler errors, and they're often going to be these cascades of errors which say, I don't know what you're talking about, plus that's not a member variable, you can't talk to it because you're not part of the class, plus this other code that tries to call the function is going to get errors. And when you fix your one character mistake and rebuild, dozens of error messages disappear. A good rule of thumb for C++ developers, when you get a lot of error messages all at once, just fix the first one and then build again, because sometimes it'll make a great number of them go away. And that's especially true when the mistake is a mistake in the header file. Now, what if I make a mistake when I'm implementing that function? So it's declared properly as getName, and it's called properly as getName, but I go in here and I just, I'm having a bad day, and I type the name wrong. I could as easily type the number of parameters wrong or the types of parameters, doesn't matter. You can see right away I'm getting red wigglies, and this is because in the header I said that there was a getName function. I didn't say there was a getNameX function, and so just as you saw when the mistake was in the header, this implementation file is like, you're not a member function of person, I don't know what you're talking about and why you think you're allowed to look at first name and last name, and you get that big clump, the same clump of error messages as when the mistake was in the header file. What if you just flat out forget to implement the function? You declared it in the header file, and you forgot that you needed to implement it. Especially if you have some functions that are in line the way getNumber and setNumber are, you might type a whole pile of functions in here and just forget that you needed to go over and implement getName. This is a problem that trips people up because the compiler is going to be perfectly happy. The compiler, when it's compiling, say, classes and objects, you notice there's no red wigglies here. GetName is declared in person.h. But when we build, these are linker errors, and the first linker errors that you'll have seen from me so far. In fact, if you really care, you notice that the error starts LNK. When you see a linker error, you always look not for a problem in a header file, but for missing implementations. So the key part of the message is it says, unresolved external symbol. Something is missing that it was expecting to be able to find. Now, because we're working with strings, this is unfortunate. You sometimes get really nasty error messages when you're using strings. We'll just skip over all of that. Here's the important part. Person, : getName. So it's telling you what is missing. And then there's some more decoration, which has to do with how overloads are implemented. Linker error messages sort of reveal a lot of the insides of C++, but you can skip over all that and get to where it turns into English again. Referenced in function _w main, which is, we call it tmain here, but there's a preprocessor thing that turns it into w main. That's not terribly vital. The key is, in amongst all the gibberish, this error message says to you, you said there would be a getName, and now I can't find it. And when you get that error message from the linker, as opposed to the compiler, it's because you forgot to implement the function. So we quickly implement it, build it, and we're back to the races again. What about, I wrote it, I implemented it, but I forgot to include the right header file. That one's the most common mistake, actually. Let's comment out this include of tweeter and build. Here the errors are only in classes and objects. When you have a mistake in a header file, you get complaints from every place that includes that header file. When you forget a header file, you only get the complaints in the place you forgot it. So here it says tweeter undeclared identifier, and then we have a sort of cascade of errors. It goes on to say, well, if I don't know what tweeter is, then this syntax is really strange. I don't know why you've got round brackets and commas and things. This isn't right. And I don't know what T1 is. I'm going to throw this whole line away, so then a little later it'll object if you try to talk to T1 because it wasn't properly declared or it doesn't know its type. The real hallmark of forgetting an include is that the errors are only in the file that the include was forgotten in. When the errors are in multiple files, they're caused by a mistake in the header that's been included into multiple files. So let's make that right again. Let's forget the header in the implementation file now. So if I go into person.cpp, because I happen to have it open, scroll up to the top, and forget to include person.h, now when this is being compiled, I'm declaring all these member functions in the person class. In fact, I'm even declaring the fact that there is a person class in a file that's not being included into here. And as you can see from all the red wigglies in here, they're like, whoa, why are you trying to talk about person? Anything that's got : after it has to be a class name. This is your clue that the compiler doesn't think person is a class name. And here it says, I don't know what getName is. Yeah, getName is a member function of person, but the compiler no longer knows that because you didn't include it here in the implementation file. So if I build it, tons of errors, all coming from person.cpp. And basically starting with this one, person is not a class or namespace name. The rest of these kind of cascade from that. You notice eventually it does give up. It says, wow, you are so messed up, I'm going to stop even trying to figure out what you mean. And that's a good sign. You don't work your way up from the bottom or pick one of these things in the middle and try to fix it. You start with the first error, person's not a class or namespace name. Oh, well, I declared person to be a class over in person.h. I forgot to include person.h. Fix it up, build it, and all the errors go away. Finally, one that's not very likely to happen as long as you're following along the way I told you how to add classes into your project, but that can trip you up, so I'll show it to you. When you look in this project, we have files over here in the Solution Explorer. When this project was built, it was built two different ways. One by right-click, add a class, which added a CPP and an H file at the same time, and one by right-click, add new item twice, once choosing CPP file and once choosing header file. And both of these approaches add the CPP file to the project. It doesn't much matter whether a header file is included in the project or not, but it really matters that an implementation file is added to the project. If you right-click any of these file tabs, you can choose Open Containing Folder. And in here, you'll see the CPP files and the H files all mixed together. And you could, if you wanted to, right-click and create a file here. Typically, people would create a text document and then rename it with a different extension. And that would add a file to this folder, but it wouldn't add the file to the project. Sometimes people give you code, and you just sort of put it in the folder, and if you forget to add it to the project, the includes will work because includes follow a path and just look on that path for a file with that name. But the linking will not work because unless the CPP file is explicitly added to the project, it won't be linked into the project. So to simulate forgetting to add, I'm going to remove a file from the project, and I'm going to remove tweeter.cpp with this exclude from project. Now you see that it disappears from here. It's still in the folder. Nothing's happened to the actual file. And if I build this, again, we're getting linker errors. They start LNK, unresolved external symbol, and it's actually complaining about two different things. One is the destructor and the other is the constructor of tweeter. They're both caused because the CPP file, tweeter.cpp, is no longer being linked into the project. Now, as long as you always add new material by right-clicking your project and choosing add, you will get things added to your project because you're busy adding them to your project. Should it ever happen that someone gives you a file of code, and especially if you then get an error like this, which is, oh, I've got to add it to the project, you can choose to add existing item. It'll start by default looking right in the folder with the rest of your code. There's tweeter.cpp. You can get it added back into the project, shows up here, and I can build, and the build succeeds. Should it happen that you get linker errors, and you're sure the code is in the file, the next step is the linker including the file? And the way to test that is to look over here in Solution Explorer and make sure that the CPP file really is in the project and not just in the solution that the project is part of. Now you've seen the full spectrum of mistakes a person can make when they're working with functions, whether you make a mistake calling it, declaring it, or implementing it. You've seen the difference between compiler error messages and linker error messages. You understand that sometimes you get dozens of error messages from a single character mistake, and that noticing whether your error messages come all from the same file or from a variety of different files is an excellent way to zero in on exactly where your problem is. I hope this makes the process of fixing error messages a lot less frustrating.